Good afternoon. Today is Tuesday, the 8th of September, and we are going to cover chapters 4, 5, and 6 today. Chapter 4 being, as you can see on the screen, demanding ethical and social responsibility. Chapter 5 will be business ownership, starting a small business, and then chapter 6 is sort of like a tag on to that, entrepreneurship and starting a small business. So let's look at our learning objectives for chapter 4. Explain why obeying the law is only the first step in behaving ethically. Ask the 3 questions you need to answer when faced with a potentially unethical action. Describe management's role in setting ethical standards. Distinguish between compliance-based and integrity-based ethics codes. And list the 6 steps in setting up a corporate ethics code. Define corporate social responsibility and compare corporations' responsibility to various stakeholders. And finally, analyze the role of U.S. businesses in influencing ethical behavior and social responsibility in global markets. So let's get into the meat of chapter 4. And the first thing we're going to talk about here is many of the scandals that have shaken the United States in the last, 10 years or so, maybe even a little bit more than that. And notice the questions that are posed here. How do we restore trust in a free market system? Do we punish those who have broken the law? I think the answer to that is yes. Make accounting records more transparent? The answer to that is also yes. And then consider what is ethical, not just legal. Remember, legal simply means we're following the law. It doesn't mean what we're doing is ethical. Now, let me give you the classic example of this. If you kept slaves in the United States before the Civil War and after the Civil War, when slavery was abolished by the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, the question you'd have to ask yourself was, was keeping slaves legal? And the answer to that question was yes. But ask the question differently. Was keeping slaves ethical? And the answer to that question is a resounding no. That's the best example I can give you about whether following the law is all we have to do. Now, this particular slide talks about the infamous Bernie Madoff and the enormous Ponzi scheme that he ran. Now, Ponzi scheme is you get many people down at the bottom, as many as possible, charge them money to get into your scheme. In his case, it was a fund. And then you gradually build up, and the people at the top are actually being paid off by the people who are at the bottom. That's why you have to have a lot of people at the bottom. The sad thing about Bernie Madoff is that an individual, I'm sorry, I don't know his name, wrote the Securities and Exchange Commission about 10 years before Madoff was busted, to use a term, and said he is promising returns that historically have never been returned in the United States stock market. That something has to be wrong. And the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, either ignored his warning or put it aside. And look at what it says down here on the slide. He is thought to have stole about $65 billion. And people will never get that amount of money back. Well, this explains to you what a Ponzi scheme is. It's pretty much what I explained. I'm not going to go over this too much, but notice that the new investors are promised opportunities. And of course, the only way that they can get those opportunities or have a chance at those opportunities is to have more investors. So they want to attract additional money so they can pay off the people who have been around longer. Now this question simply asks, what is ethics? And ethics is explained very clearly on this slide. It's the standards of moral behavior that are generally accepted by society as being right versus wrong. Here are some basic moral values. We won't go over all of these. Notice the top one on the right is, or excuse me, on the left as you're looking at is integrity, honesty, and courage. And then we see things on the right side which are wrong, dishonesty, cruelty, etc. I think this is an interesting slide because it points out what a number of people just simply don't understand about plagiarism. And plagiarism is a form of cheating. It is using work from someone else and submitting that as your work. The cartoon says it all. Young fellow doesn't understand what plagiarism is, so he's just going to go to the internet, download something, and cut and paste. And that's what happens. Anytime you use a source in a paper that you write, you have to cite the source, telling the people where you get the information. That must be followed. Otherwise, submitting that as your own work is plagiarism, and it's a form of cheating, or perhaps you prefer to say it's a form of stealing. Now, here's the question that's you should ask, or a series of questions that you ought to ask yourselves when you're faced with an ethical dilemma. An ethical dilemma simply means you're faced with something that could be equally, both choices could be equally right, both choices could be equally wrong, but you have to make some kind of decision. Normally speaking, it's usually between two unsatisfactory alternatives, neither one of which you would really want to make. So you can see these questions. This comes from Norman Vincent Peale and management writer Ken Blanchard and a few other people. And it follows along with what the Rotarians do, although they ask a series of 4 questions. To notice them, and you find these on pages 97 and 98 in your text. It also asks, is what I'm going to do fair? Is it balanced? And then how will I feel about myself after I make this decision? Now, there's another question a lot of people like to ask, and I like to ask it, and that is, how will my family and friends feel if they see my decision broadcast on the 11 o'clock news, telecast on the 11 o'clock news? That just takes it a step further. This just gives you some idea of cases of bribery. I'm not going to go through these. You can see these for yourself, read them for yourself, and get some indication of what we're talking about. This just talks here about turning ex-convicts, people who've been convicted of felonies, into entrepreneurs. I really don't, and I'm not going to pay a lot of attention to this slide. It is interesting, and it's something we really need to think about grappling with, because people who come out of prison have a tough life. And whatever we can do to get them back into society on the straight and narrow and contributing is to our benefit being taxpayers' benefits, because the rate of recidivism, those returning to jail after they've already been in jail or prison, is in this country is high. And we need to do whatever we can to reduce that. Now, this particular slide is something that really should not surprise any of you. And we're talking about ethics in organizations here. And that is ethical behavior starts at the top. What do I mean by this? Or what does the slide mean by this? Or what does the text mean by this? It's simply this. If an organization has written ethical rules, an ethical code of conduct, and employees consistently see top management paying lip service to that. In other words, they're saying, okay, here it is posted on the wall, but it doesn't apply to me. It goes to like padding expense accounts and doing things of that nature. What can we expect the rank and file employee to do? He or she's going to say, well, if it's good for the boss, it's good for me. And unfortunately, this permeates an atmosphere and can poison an atmosphere. So a manager must walk the talk and talk the walk. And he or she must be ethical and expect ethical behavior. Notice down here they talk about a atmosphere of trust. And so that's what we want this to be. We want people who are violators to be admonished or punished in some way. And we don't want it just to be for those people further down on the pecking order. This particular slide points out the factors that influence individual managerial ethics or managerial ethics in total, but I like to break it down to individual. It talks about individual here on the left, organizational in the middle, and then environmental on the end. And notice we talk about values here, family status. In the organization, we talk about management's philosophy, specifically top management's philosophy. A reward system which should be based upon good works. And in environmental, we have things that impact your competition and economic conditions and things of that nature. Now, what this kind of tells you is that some of these things, especially what we see on the right, can influence ethical behavior. And that's probably true. But if people have good grounding in ethics from society, from family upbringing, those things are not going to bother them. Now, we have two kinds of ethical codes in organizations. The first being compliance-based, and compliance-based simply means following the law. So we go back to my example of what we saw with slavery in the United States. It not only was the law, it was written into the Constitution of the United States. And when we think of some of the words that are in the Constitution about freedom and things of that nature, how in the world did we codify slavery? Did we say it was okay? Obviously that's a philosophical argument, happened more than 100 years ago, or 150 years ago now. If we look at the end of the Civil War, which was in April of 1865, I can't answer that question. I wasn't around. But we have to say, our forefathers, in some cases, not all of them, but some of them, really weren't paying attention. And slavery, not just slavery in the United States, but slavery in itself inhibits innovation. It inhibits invention because people are just used to having other people do the work for them. An integrity-based code, on the other hand, by the way, you can see the features of these on page 101 in your text, figure 4.3. Integrity-based defines what the company stands for. These are our values. This is what we want to do. This is how we act with people. And I guess my favorite story about this, about integrity-based codes, it comes from Mars Candy. Mars had their 5 principles of Mars, and one of theirs was reciprocity. And what they meant by reciprocity was they intended to treat their clients, customers, suppliers, as they wanted to be treated. And the story that illustrates this is there was a buyer from Mars. He was down in Central or South America, I can't remember which, and he was there to buy cocoa beans. And he came upon a broker who was having some financial difficulties, and said the broker said, "Hey, we'll take this order here, this shipment, but we'll pay you less money for it. So instead of paying him $100,000, we'll pay you $90,000." And so he got back to headquarters and thought he'd be patted on the back for saving the company money. Instead, he was admonished. He was told, "We don't treat people that way. We may be in the same situation." And Mars went back to the broker, said, "We're going to tear up the contract. You write a new contract for the normal price, and that's what we'll pay. We may be in your situation someday and would expect the same type of action from you." Pretty powerful, as far as I'm concerned. Now, excuse me, I've skipped over a slide here. I beg your pardon. This is how we improve business ethics. Notice what it starts off with: top management has to adopt a code of ethics and say, this is what we stand for. Each employee must be given a copy of that code of ethics, so he or she knows what actions are expected of them. Then there must be training that goes on, and there should be ongoing training. Now, when I say ongoing, I don't mean every day or every week or every month, but I do mean it should be conducted this year and again next year and again some other time. So we get people who are they're inculcated in this, and people need to know what the implications of their decisions are going to be, especially if they're unethical. Then we have to have an office set up where people can report unethical behavior without fear of retribution. And we need to protect whistleblowers, those people who call attention to unethical behavior. Now, one of the problems we have here is that most people who become whistleblowers are looked down upon by their fellow employees. And we need to change that mindset so that whistleblowers are seen in a different light. Unfortunately, whistleblowers take the high road, and they don't understand, in many cases, the harm they cause to other employees who may lose their jobs, etc. And I'm talking about people who lose their jobs not because of something they did, but because a whistleblower caused the company to lose money, etc., etc. Regardless, whistleblowers have a place in our society, and they need to be protected. Once we have this code either developed or in formulation, we need to get input from outside sources, those folks who are our customers, those folks who are our suppliers, those people in government, maybe the local community, so they see what we're about and help us along the way. And then finally, let's see, I'll move this up just a little bit for you. The ethics code must be enforced. So people must understand that not only do we have an ethical code, and it's in practice, we're going to enforce it. And those people who don't follow the ethical code will be brought to account. Now, this talks about how to blow the whistle. I guess it's okay to talk about how to blow the whistle. But notice here what it says is that you need to, one, decide and have some careful consideration about that, but that you need to act quickly. Don't let it continue. Have all the information that you need to have. Don't be continually gathering it. Notice it talks about filing your allegations with as many agencies as you possibly can. Now, these are talking about governmental agencies or agencies that are creditors or professional organizations that a company may belong to. And then don't be nefarious. In other words, don't sneak around and get your information. Get your information legally. This particular slide talks about corporate social responsibility. And this simply means that a corporation has concern for the welfare of the greater society. Notice it's based upon a commitment to integrity, fairness, and respect. Now, please take that to extension that we respect the environment. We want to be good stewards of the environment. It's important to remember that there is but one environment. We're not going to get another one. And so we have to do things to help maintain what it is that we have. And we also have to remember that if it were not for society and the people that live in society, we would not have the business or be in business that we are, because it is society that allows us to operate. Now, corporate philanthropy just talks about charity and doing good works. It could mean supporting a symphony or arts, or could be supporting a local elementary school or a secondary school. It could be helping renovate parks and other types of recreation that is used by the general public. Notice here that corporate social responsibility includes everything that a company does that interacts with the social fabric in which it operates. And this means hiring minorities, making safe products, etc. Now, we know that the Civil Rights Act of 1964, particularly Title VII, it says we cannot discriminate in hiring practices and other personnel practices. But what this is saying is means actively recruiting minorities and women to the workforce. Now, immediately somebody's going to say, well, wait a minute, that may mean lowering our standards. No, it does not mean that. It means that you're going to actively seek out minority and women members of society within your operating area that have the credentials that you're looking for, and that you intend to hire the best of the best. And the way things work out, pardon me, a certain percentage of them will be minorities, a certain percentage will be women. And this is corporate policy goes on. It takes a firm stance on societal and political issues. And political issues here, I know that some organizations, large organizations, take a particular stance at about the specific people running for office, one party or another. And that's true, and I can't get away from that. But what you would rather see companies do is take specific stands on things that are good for the whole welfare of all society, not just a particular segment of society. Well, we have things that are, this says positive impacts of companies. And we can look at many things that companies do. Xerox, for instance, it's mentioned here, a social service leave program for their employees. But Xerox is an outstanding company when it comes to hiring minorities and women. That has a long-standing record. 48% of its management positions are made up of women and minorities. And its former CEO was a woman, and she was replaced by another woman. First time in the history of business in the United States that one woman CEO handed off her position to another woman. And so notice also down here that MBA students say that they would accept a lower salary if they could work for a company that was seen as being socially responsible. I point that out. I don't know how true that is because the survey is not particularly cited. And often we need to find out when the survey was taken and who it was taken with, etc. I say that because some people may change their minds over a period of time. Are these recent college graduates or recent MBA graduates, are they still in school? What's their status? Now, you would hope that results of that survey would be true across the entire spectrum. I doubt that it is, although I certainly would hope that it would be. This is just a slide here. I like to call these gee whiz slides. I'll give some information about Helping Hands celebrities and what they do. And then here's some other generous people down here, such as Bill Gates, and Warren Buffett, and Mark Zuckerberg, Michael Bloomberg, the Walton family, owners of, our majority stockholders of Walmart, etc. Now, in continuing with this ethical theme, if you will, President Kennedy talked about consumers having 4 rights. And notice what they are: a right to safety, the right to be informed. That means when you're buying something, you get all the information about the uses of the product and potential drawbacks, etc. The right to make your own choice. And finally, the right to be heard. And what the president was talking about here was you have a right to have your complaint, if you will, heard by someone. And we've had people in Congress try to keep us away from having folks that are known as ombudsmen, who would look into consumer complaints, et cetera, et cetera. And we always hear about the woman who was burned with McDonald's coffee, and sometimes we think, well, that woman wasn't paying attention, et cetera, et cetera. But there's a reason for warnings. And it is to tell people that, hey, you know, what you're opening up here may cause you harm if you don't pay attention to it. And we need to get away from the old thought of caveat emptor, buyer beware. So products are safe. People know that they're safe. There's information about safe use of products, etc. By the same token, no manufacturer should be held responsible if someone uses a product in a way it's not intended to be used. Question here is, how do customers know? Notice the primary use of Facebook. Social media allows companies to reach out. It also allows customers to reach out. And connection goes both ways. So with social media around today, it's more important than ever that companies live up to their word. So social customer contact do's and don'ts of using Twitter for business. Notice here are the don'ts. Don't use it to rant. Don't do things about that nature. And for businesses, they need to offer new content, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to go through that to a great extent. This is an issue that has flumfloxed America, its markets, et cetera, for a long period of time, and that's insider trading. Excuse me. It sounded like I said training, and I didn't mean to say that. Picture here is of Stephen Cohen. You see down on page 105 of the text. He runs a very large hedge fund called SAC Capital Advisors. Some of his employees were indicted for unethical behavior and insider trading. He himself was not called to account, but did agree on behalf of the company to pay a large fine in millions of dollars to the Securities and Exchange Commission, and he is barred from managing some funds for a period of years. So what insiders do is they use information that they have to take advantage of information that the general public doesn't have. And notice what unethical behavior does. It really damages the reputation of a company. Not something that companies want, and companies need to think twice about doing things in this realm. Now, this is talking about a responsibility of companies have to their employees. And we don't often think about this, but it is to create jobs and to offer the opportunity. Notice I said the opportunity for upward mobility. Treat everyone with respect. Now, of course, this goes beyond just employees. It goes to customers, et cetera. And then offer the requisite pay package for people that will allow them to live good lives. These are America's most admired companies, although I just read a rather scathing article about employment practices at Amazon. It was in the New York Times about 3 weeks ago on Sunday. We have to be careful when we have disgruntled and upset employees. Fraud costs the United States businesses a large amount of money. Notice it says 5% of their revenue, and causes up to 30% of business failures. Disgruntled workers pass the blame. They do things like manipulation of financial figures, and notice that they make commitments that they don't intend to hold. So these are people that really cause us lots of problems, and we have to be on the lookout for them. This is just talking about a third of us work for nonprofits. Green movement has caught on and is moving more and more and more. And notice down here I talked about companies becoming good stewards of the environment. I mentioned that to you before, and this is just here talking about removing the carbon footprint. Just talking here about responsibility for the environment, I think there's an interesting bullet here at the end. By 2030, which is 15 years from now, approximately 40 million Americans will be working for some company that is involved with either having or creating green jobs. This talks about sustainability and what we can expect from that. This particular company, Rickshaw Bag Works, makes sustainable products, and it tries to follow three F's for the company, and form, function, and footprint. Footprint simply meaning reducing the carbon footprint. And finally, social auditing is something that companies do to watch what they do and how they interact. It's also used by investors, companies that look for socially conscious research organization, environmentalists, union officials, and customers. So that brings us to the end of, I'm not going to speak about international ethics other than to tell you that U.S. companies doing business overseas must follow the ethical laws that were passed by the Congress of the United States. So simply being in a foreign country doesn't allow you to not follow the laws of the United States. The law passed was 1970s, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And if any American company is caught bribing, they can be liable for criminal charges. Well, it's 4:58. We spent the last 40 minutes or so discussing social and ethical behavior. And we will take a short break. I'll come back at 5:03 and begin discussing Chapter 5, which is starting a small business and the forms, different forms of business, actually titled How to Farm a Business. So thank you, and please come back at 5:03. All right, 503. We're now going to speak Chapter 5, How to Form a Business. Now we're going to discuss the three major forms of business found in the United States, plus a couple of others. Get you up to speed, and you'll get some idea about whether you want to use some of these things. Take advantage of some of the take advantage of some of the things that are good in each one of these, and decide how to start your own business if in fact you want to. So I'm going to compare the advantages and disadvantages of sole proprietorships. We're going to look at the differences between general and limited partners and compare the advantages and disadvantages of partnerships. We're going to compare the advantages and disadvantages of corporations and then summarize the differences between C corporations, S corporations, and limited liability companies, LLCs. We're going to define and give examples of three types of corporate mergers, explain the role of leveraged buyouts and taking a firm private, such as Dell Computer just did. And then outline the advantages and disadvantages of franchises, discuss the opportunities for diversity in franchising and the challenge of global franchising, and finally explain the role of cooperatives. All right, here are the three major forms of business ownership in the United States: sole proprietor, a partnership, and a corporation. This particular corporation, known as a C corporation, that's the traditional corporation. Sole proprietorship, exactly what it says. One person's in charge. He or she may have employees working, but this business is owned and operated, most often even managed by one individual. Partnership, where two or more people agree to become co-owners of a business. And a corporation, notice what a corporation is. It's a legal entity. It's also known as a social construct. We have said this is a corporation. And we all know a corporation when we see it, but remember, a corporation is not buildings, it's not land, it's not machinery, it's not equipment, etc. Or employees. It's all of those things. And if you take something out, it ceases to be a corporation. The big thing about corporation is the entity, the management of the entity, has authority to act without consulting the owners, normally stockholders, and has liability apart from the owners. This particular slide shows us the forms of business, the percentage of forms of business in the United States. Over 7 out of 10 companies in the United States are owned and operated by a sole proprietor. Partnerships make up 8%, and corporations make up the remaining 20%. But look at the difference in receipts. 20% of the businesses, the corporations, are responsible for 81% of the total receipts. Now that's what they take in. Partnerships get 13% and sole proprietors at 6%. They suggest ethnic business centers in the United States, which I'm not going to spend a lot of time on. Now, here are the major benefits of being a sole proprietor. First of all, it takes very little to start the business. You're in charge. Of course, pride of ownership comes along with that. You have the potential of leaving something for your children or to someone else that you want to. You get to keep all the profits, and there are no special taxes. Now, what do I mean by no special taxes? Well, in a sole proprietorship, the sole proprietor and the business are one and the same. So the sole proprietor pays tax as an individual, and he or she is still paying tax as an individual on that company. Of course, profit has to be rolled into that or lost depending upon the case, but you don't pay anything different. Now, here's the disadvantages of being a sole proprietor. The first and foremost is unlimited liability. Now, remember what I said before, you're the business is you. That also means that any outstanding debt comes to you. It can't be passed on to somebody else. And it also means that to satisfy your debt, creditors can take some of your property or all of it. Sole proprietors, for the most part, have limited financial resources because they do a lot of the operating themselves. There are difficulties with management. There's no downtime. There are few, if any, fringe benefits, unless you can say pride of ownership is a fringe benefit. Because you have limited financial resources, the potential to grow can be limited. Now, I want to come back to that in a second. And also has a limited lifespan, life of the proprietor, unless he or she passes it on. Limited growth. Now, I want to qualify that by saying that unless you find additional resources, monetary resources, your ability to grow is going to be limited. However, if you do find an investor that has deep pockets, that limitation is removed. Notice this particular slide, and by the way, this is a new one for me. Small business owners work over 80 hours a week, work over 40 hours a week. That's a big percentage that work more than 40. Not quite so much that work over 80, but that's still a large number when you think about it. Now, there are different types of partnerships. Of course, we talked, 2 or more people agree to go into business together. There's a general where all the owners operate the business and they are equally responsible for debt. And then a limited partnership, a little bit different than this, but where one or more of the partners is limited. And what we mean by limited is, excuse me, here, let me get to this down here a second. We'll get to limited here in a second. Here's your general manager, or excuse me, the general partners. They're active on everything in the business. Operations, have unlimited liability, et cetera, et cetera. A limited person is a person who invests money but is not active in management or operations of the company. And therefore, he or she has what's known as limited liability. Their liability is limited to what they put into the company, but their personal assets are not at risk. So we need to think about this again. Liability for debts of the business is limited to the amount the limited partner put in. So if the limited partner put in $50,000, that's all he is liable for, or she is liable for. Can't come after their personal assets. Or general partner that can. Of course, we know there's the sole proprietor that can. Well, if there, what are the advantages here? Here we're talking mostly about a general partnership. Obviously, if you have two or more people putting money in, then you're going to have more financial resources. You have the potential to have a sharing of duties. For instance, one person could be good at management, the other person could be good at maybe logistics or something of that nature. Or maybe that person's the technical person. I'll give you an example. I knew a small business that dealt with a small business in Indiana many years ago. And there were partners. And the one partner took care of the business. As far as I know, he never left the office. He did the administration. He probably did the payroll and things like that. I don't remember how many people he had working for him. The other guy was the sales guy. He was out meeting customers and pushing product and things of that nature. And that's how they work. Obviously, if you have more financial resources, the opportunity to stay in business longer exists. And just like a sole proprietorship, there are no special taxes. Well, obviously, with a list of advantages also come disadvantages. We know about the liability situation. It's unlimited. Profits have to be split. If it's a general partnership with two people, unless otherwise specified, it's going to be a 50-50 split. And sometimes that causes problems because one person goes think, well, I do more work than the other guy does, or I do more work than the other girl does. Why am I not getting more money? And of course, that comes right to the next one, disagreements. And then because it's a partnership, and because there is usually a contract between the two people, it is more difficult to end the business. Now, this particular slide talks about how you go about picking your partner. And I don't really want to go through this laundry list. I commend it to you. I think it's something that you ought to think about if you're thinking about a partnership. But look at vision. Do we both have the same idea of where we want the company to go? What are our goals? What's our vision? What's our overarching vision? What is it we want to do? Are the skills complementary? Now, what I mean here by complementary isn't so much that they complement each other, although that's good, but it is, are these skills complementary for the work that needs to be done? So one person, like my example, people up in Indiana, one person good at management, the other person's good at selling. That helps because that helps the company. What does this person bring to the business? Does he or she bring contacts? Does he or she bring a certain type of expertise over and above something? Those are all things to ask yourself. And I guess one of the biggest issues down here is trust. Do we trust each other? And that's a big issue because a lot of companies, a lot of partnerships start based upon like or mutual interest. But the partners, even though they like each other, even though they have mutual interests, have never developed a sense of trust. And so that's something that really needs to be thought through. If I'm laid up someplace, incapacitated for some reason, Do I trust this guy or gal to make the right decision? And this particular thing just is a question here: good business or bad karma, and what you should do is obviously this is also an ethical decision question here. So look at that, presented in the text. Not something that's required for an assignment, but it's always good to look at these things so we would start making decisions to help you make decisions. I'll say a little bit better. This is conventional, or perhaps a better word to use would be traditional. C corporation. Notice that a corporation, that what they're talking about here, is a legal entity chartered by a state. And it has authority to act and have liability separate from the owners, stockholders. Now, I'll give you an example. My wife and I own stock in several companies. We don't have anything to say about how the company manages its business on a day-to-day basis. We do have a say in electing the board of directors and a few other type things. We get to vote on that on an annual basis. But we don't tell the company and have no authority to tell the company how it should be operated. Well, there's some advantages of these folks. Let's look at them. They have limited liability. They, because of their size, they can attract more financial resources. They will have, I don't like the term perpetual life, but I suppose we could use that. Much different than sole proprietor or general partnerships. There's much, it's an easier way to change ownership, although sometimes it gets involved in the Securities and Exchange Commission, perhaps the large enough Federal Trade Commission, and a few others. So ease of change of ownership may not be completely correct, but I'll give you an example. If there's a significantly large shareholder and he or she decides that they want to affect management change, they can ask shareholders to vote for management change, and that can make some big difference. Because of their immense resources, the ability to attract certain types of people that have specific skills is enormous. And finally, what I was just talking about, operations management is separated from ownership. Here's how owner managers affect management. Notice how they do this there. You have owners, stockholders up here at the top, board of directors, then top management, being officers, supervisors, and then finally rank and file employees. This just gives you an idea of the largest corporations in the United States. These are all United States companies. Some of them, of course, are multinational. I do believe, however, Apple is now larger than Walmart. Not 100% sure of that, but I think I'm right. These are the 10 largest private corporations in the United States. Means they're closely held, and they do not have to report quarterly earnings as publicly traded companies do with the Securities and Exchange Commission. Some of these you may have heard, some of you may not. I spoke about Dell a little earlier, and Dell just went private in the last year or so. Now, there are some disadvantages to corporations. If you want to start a corporation, it's going to cost a lot of money. A lot of paperwork, double taxation. I'll come back to that in a second. Size can be a deterrent or a disadvantage. It's difficult to terminate or end a company. And then obviously, and this happens quite frequently, a conflict between stockholders and the board of directors, and also between the board of directors and top management. Double taxation is simply this. Company has to pay taxes, or the corporation has to pay taxes. And then if the corporation issues dividends, the stockholders have to pay tax on the dividends, and those dividends are paid out of after-tax earnings. This is just, even the big guys make mistakes. Probably the classic one is Coca-Cola bringing out new Coke, lasted a grand total of 77 days on the market before it was pulled. These are B corporations. And notice that B corporations down here at the bottom are judged on how they meet their own set of socially or environmentally beneficial goals. The question becomes here, who can incorporate? And the answer is anybody. We find a number of professional folks like lawyers, dentists, physicians, and even some regular small business owners incorporate. Normally speaking, when private people incorporate, there's no stock that's issued. So advantages and disadvantages are not the same. They don't transfer equally the way they do to large corporations. Major advantages are limited liability and possible tax benefits of incorporating. You decide you want to open a small business, I would advise you to seek advice from a lawyer as to whether incorporating would be a good business strategy for you. These are some of America's oldest corporations. Looked at J.E. Rhodes and Sons. Makes conveyor belts, goes back to 1702. S corporation, and by the way, the United States government's had a lot of problems with this. There are organizations that have filed for S corporation status, and their business is not on the up and up. And the government's having a lot of difficulty with these. So the government created these folks that they look like a corporation, but they're taxed like a sole proprietor or a partnership. They do have shareholders, directors, and they do have limited liability. And notice that profits are taxed only as personal income of the shareholder. So the shareholder wouldn't have another thing to go through, another loop to jump through, if you will, or hoop to jump through, excuse me. Now there are some limitations here, or qualifications, the slide says, and that's no more than 100 shareholders. They have to be citizens or permanent residents of the United States, so those shareholders. One class of stock, and no more than 25% of the income can be from passive sources. Passive sources are things like rent, interest, and things of that nature. If the corporation loses its status, it cannot reapply for S corporation status for 5 years. A limited liability company, LLC, is a little bit different. Very similar, but does not have the same eligibility requirements. Again, limited liability, choice of taxation, flexible ownership rules, and operating flexibility. Notice there's no stock ownership. Ownership that is not, therefore not transferable. Usually only has a limited lifespan. There are fewer incentives. There is a lot of paperwork, and taxes are different. So again, something you're thinking about, you want to start a company, seek advice of counsel before you decide to do that. Mergers and acquisitions. Pardon me. A merger is, normally speaking, two equal companies deciding to merge and become one. An acquisition is where one company buys out another company's property, obligations, etc. Different types of mergers. Vertical, two or more firms in different stages of related business. Horizontal is joining two firms in the same business, and conglomerate is joining two firms that are totally unrelated. A leveraged buyout, or as the slide says, LBO, is an attempt by employees and management for a group of investors to buy out the stockholders of a particular company. Notice the range in size from 50 million to 34 billion. And notice also foreign investors have poured in this amount of money. Now, we talked about small businesses, sole proprietorships. We've talked about partnerships. We've talked about corporations, LLCs, S corporations. Well, let's talk about franchises. A franchise agreement is where the parent company, the franchisor, sells the rights to use his or her products, or sell his or her products or services in a specific geographic area. And notice it's called a franchise. You have the franchise, the franchisor, and then the person who takes this entity on for his own particular or her own particular geographical area is known as the franchisee. Almost 750,000 people in the United States own and operate franchises. Here's the many new franchises. I'm not going to go over this information you may be interested in reading or seeing, but it's not something that's really important. It's just like I like to call a gee whiz slide. Now, what are the advantages of franchising? Well, yeah, I suppose the major advantage of franchising is having a well-known name. And because you get that, you get assistance with marketing and management. Obviously, personal ownership is part of that. These folks will also give you assistance, financial assistance, and sometimes loans. And because a franchise has a recognized name, the rate of failure for a small business is much less than it would be for a regular startup. But they come with disadvantages. The first is large startup costs. Now, I remember many years ago, if you wanted to buy a McDonald's franchise, now I'm talking about many, many years ago, uh, I think the startup cost was somewhere around $98,000. Today, it's $500,000 or more. It talks here about shared profit. Now, what does that mean? That means that you need to return to the franchisor X cents on every dollar of profits you make. So it's 3% or something of that nature. You have to follow the regulations. Notice here it talks about coattail effects. And what that means is if the franchise name is doing well, your chances of doing well increase. And of course, the reverse is true. Not doing well, your chances of losing or not making as much profit also increase. Talks about restrictions on selling. Now, it simply means you cannot go outside your territory. Now, you want to buy another location outside your territory, that's a different thing. But if you're at the corner of 4th and Main Street, and there's another location at the corner of 10th and Main Street, same franchise, you can't sell up there at 10th Street or 11th, 12th, and 13th because that's their territory. Your territory is from 4th to 9th. And of course, obviously, there are franchises that are not on the up and up, which obviously will cause problems. These are just building blocks of franchising, which I'm not going to go into. Women in franchising, we finding more and more women owning franchises. Notice it's about 21% now, 1 in 5. And also notice that some of the franchises are franchises that are traditionally associated with women. I'm not going to say that Jazzercise is not known by men, but I have never known anybody who owned a Jazzercise franchise that was a male. More minority-owned franchises. Domino's has been on a big kick to get more minorities into franchising, and it's something that they really have pushed. And of course, this is a good thing for both minorities and the communities that minorities serve. There are home-based franchises as well, and obviously there are some advantages of that. You don't have to commute. I don't know about extra family time. I would say that may or may not be true. Of course, if you take commuting time out, then yeah, that's true. No additional overhead expenses. I think the thing here about isolation as a disadvantage is key. And of course, long hours. Well, long hours come in almost any franchise. These are top home-based franchises in the United States. Again, something that I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, or as a matter of fact, any time on. E-commerce franchising, something that we may not think too much about because this is something different than brick and mortar franchises. Possibility, some franchises are only online. You need to be careful about when you get into these things, to do due diligence the same way you do with a regular franchise. This is just simply giving entrepreneurs options with digital franchising. Again, it's not something I'm going to talk a great deal about, but it is something you may want to look at. If you're interested in this, it does have an avenue for entrepreneurs. Global franchising is exactly what it says. Many franchises in the United States that originate in the United States can be found certainly in Europe, Canada, China, Central, South America, every place. No boundaries here. Now, in picking a franchise that may survive recession, and let's not even talk about recession, which we're slowly getting out of. Let's even talk about a normal economic downturn. Stick with something that's well known. Have a site that gets good foot traffic. Excuse me. Talks about not pinching pennies. I think that's difficult to do when there's an economic downturn because that's something that gets ingrained in our mind. Have an alternative. Finally, don't assume that the franchise is going to pay off. Be choosy about the site. There's always a thing about, particularly about franchises, and that is everything boils down to location, location, location. These are top performing franchises in the United States. And then we're going to talk just a little bit about cooperatives. Once I can get here. Yeah, let's see if I can move this up and get to cooperatives. Here we go. These are businesses that are owned and operated by the people who use them. Could be producers, consumers, workers, etc. Notice that cooperatives worldwide have about 1 billion members, and members are elected democratically, and control of the business is run by the elected board of directors, and then they usually hire professional management. We're reaching almost 5:40. We're going to take a break and come back at 5:44 and discuss chapter 6. Thank you. Please come back at 5:44. All right, we're back. We're going to discuss Chapter 6, Entrepreneurship and Starting a Small Business. Learning objectives for this chapter. We're going to explain why people take the risk for entrepreneurship. I'm going to list some of the attributes of successful entrepreneurs. Discuss the importance of small business in the American economy. Summarize the ways to learn about how small businesses operate. Analyze what it takes to start and run a small business. And then we're going to outline the advantages and disadvantages for small business and global markets. Well, we kind of talked about entrepreneurship in Chapter 1, and I'm really not going to go over this again. It just gives you a repeat of what we've already discussed. This is somebody, an entrepreneur, is somebody who accepts the risks of starting and running a business. And for some entrepreneurs, that's the whole thing. This particular slide you can find on page 152, or at least some of the information at the bottom of page 152 about some famous companies in the United States that were started by entrepreneurs. And this particular slide gives you information about some young entrepreneurs who earned while they were learning. And this can be found in the Spotlight on Small Business at the top of page 153. Never too young to be an entrepreneur. You're never too old to be an entrepreneur. I mentioned to you Colonel Sanders started KFC, Kentucky Fried Chicken, when he was past 65. He was collecting Social Security. So there's reasons to start your business right away. People who have children who left home don't have any financial obligations, or very few. There's nobody there to disrupt you from doing what you want to do, children, those obligations. You can use your alma mater to find resources. Resources being customers, of course, perhaps a way to find funds, and things of that nature. Why do you want to take risk? Well, obviously, most people are struck by opportunity. Now, that doesn't mean they want to act on it necessarily, but they're struck by it. It is the chance to keep all the earnings for yourself. It is challenging. And then, of course, you have no one telling you what to do. You can do whatever you want, whenever you want. Now, of course, some of that can be foolhardy, but on the other hand, it does give you the opportunity. This talks about what some of these entrepreneurs could do with the amount of money that they've earned. This talks about this particular slide, and it's mentioned here in the text. What does it take to be an entrepreneur? And I think the biggest thing there is that you have to be self-directed. Now, that does not mean if you work for another company, in other words, you're an employee who receives a paycheck, that you can't be self-directed. You can be. A lot of times people are. But this means that you don't need outside forces giving you parameters in which to work. And finally, the one you can't see, but I'll pull this up here, a tolerance for uncertainty. Entrepreneurs understand that everything's not going to go their way all the time, and they're willing to accept that. We've talked about that. I need to move on here. Excuse me. Now, 5 steps to starting a business in your school. We used to have a case study. We worked. The case studies a little bit different today from the text, and I'm not using them in the course at this time. I may try to incorporate them the next time. But talks about starting a business at school, but this goes across the board. It's not just confined to school. Find a need or a want that people have, and then develop something to satisfy that need or want. Be specific. Don't be out here at the fringes someplace. Zero in. Do your research. This talks about campus, but you're going to start business for yourself when you're out of school. Again, do the research. And then don't hesitate. Move forward. Here's a thing about opportunity. Need or want something a customer needs. You have the skills to be able to deliver that. Notice this next one. It's very, very important. We'll talk about pricing when we get to the chapters on marketing. But too often, an entrepreneur will start a business and he or she will think that that has to sell what's known as a penetration price. In other words, they have to undercut the big boys and gals in the market, so they'll have this penetration price, and then they find out, I can't make any money at this price. What's the dilemma? The dilemma is it's very difficult to raise prices unless there's a reason. And if the reason is just because I can't make money, that's not going to go. And then ability to get your product to the customer when he or she needs it, not sometime later, and that you have the ability to give follow-up service. Very, very important. Entrepreneurial teams, very critical. Work together. Number of people that can, again, here work together, have a symbiotic relationship, so they can do the things they need to do. Management, somebody's doing the product, et cetera, et cetera. Talks about the entrepreneurial team that was started at Apple, which eventually helped lead them to success down the road. Micropreneurs. All right. These are people who are willing to accept the risk of starting a small business with no intention to get large. They're doing what they want to do, and perhaps it accommodates their lifestyle. Notice that about half of these folks are home-based. Usually work with writers and consultants, et cetera, et cetera. And nearly 60% of these folks are men. This talks about home-based business growth. I'm not going to talk too much about this other than many people have been sort of pushed into this area because of corporate downsizing. We don't think as much bad connotation about people who run businesses out of their homes as there may have been at one time. And then their laws have changed to allow people to use their homes to gain tax deductions. But remember, home-based business is not necessarily easy. You may have difficulty attracting clients because they don't know where you are. And because you're at home. Now, this by the way, what this particular bullet is applicable to starting a business and you're working in a store someplace or a storefront someplace or an office. And that is time management. It is critical, especially for sole proprietors. We talked about that a little bit in the last chapter, and also for entrepreneurs. Family intrudes on you all the time. That's true for all of us. But family concerns are especially can be especially harmful to an entrepreneur who's trying to start something up. Now, I'm not saying that family concerns are harmful in general. I'm just talking about harmful to someone trying to start a business. You may have trouble with government ordinances, so you need to find out about it. And then home insurance may or may not pay for loss. Something you need to make sure you find out about. These are some benefits of home-based businesses. Some of this is pretty easy to figure out. Not a lot upfront cost, or not having to pay overhead. Because I'm at home, I can set my way I want to work, etc. I don't have to commute, and there are some tax benefits. But there are downsides, and this is the first one. I want to turn the first one around back into time management. Difficult. Isolation. You may not have the right workspace. Again, the zoning restrictions that we talked about. This is just a little quiz. We're not going to talk about too much here, but you think you're ready to work at home? And here's a little quiz you can take. And you can find that. It's also a quiz in here about entrepreneurial readiness questionnaire on page 156, with the answers on page 157. So these are things that you want to think about, ask yourself, and they're kind of the same. This is a little bit different here because it's talking about working from home, but that entrepreneurial-based questionnaire certainly applies both places. Online businesses, we talked about that in the last chapter, and I'm not going to discuss it anymore here, but just notice that there were $262 billion in online sales 2 years ago. This is affiliate marketing, and it's something you could look into. Marketing strategy in which a business rewards individuals or other businesses for each visitor or customer the affiliate sends to the website. It's kind of like recruiting in a way, and you can look at it from that aspect. Here's what you have to do to boost your business's online presence. Be known. Ease of access. And notice here, find good ideas that help other people be successful and adopt them for yourself. There's nothing wrong with that unless you're taking information that's proprietary, and then that could cause you trouble. But most of what we talk about here would not fall into that category, so that should not be an issue. An entrepreneur is a person who works for a company. And this person is creative, and he or she is really an entrepreneur. The difference is he or she is working for someone else and not for him or herself. Now, the famous story here about Art Fry, he's the man who, one of the two men, the other guy I've seen his name a couple times, but he's really not prominently mentioned. One of the people that started or developed Post-it notes. And this is a real story. I'll digress through this for a second. Fry started doing this, looking for an adhesive. He worked for Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing, 3M, makers of Scotch brand cellophane tape. Well, the adhesive didn't work, but it did help him in his church choir. He sang in his church choir, and let him keep the pages separate. So he said, hey, I've got a great idea here. Sent a note to his bosses. Nobody cared about it. So he decided, okay, well, the only thing I can do, get their attention, I'll send them a note, I'll put a Post-it note to it. Well, then it got their attention. And so they decided that 3M decided we're going to put this product into production. And lo and behold, none of their vendors, those that sold 3M products, the wholesalers that sold the product, they would take them. So somebody at 3M got the names of executive secretary of Fortune 500 companies, sent them a letter and attached a Post-it note to it. And of course, right away, these folks decided they wanted Post-it notes, and they called their suppliers and found out, well, they didn't have them. Well, that's a long story short. But the other part I want to add to this is that 3M is well known as an innovative company. It will allow a person to try to bring a product to fruition, give them 2 years in a budget and staff. If after 2 years, product doesn't come to fruition, person goes back to where he or she worked, no questions asked. Notice here what they do. That's their mantra. And yet, they didn't think RFI had a good idea. Government gets involved with entrepreneurship and establishing enterprise zones where they try to attract business investment, offering lower taxes, etc. And then incubators. These are offices that provide services to startup companies for no cost or very low cost. We know what small businesses are, but this is the definition by the Department of Commerce, the Small Business Administration. Independently owned and operated and not dominant in their business. And then, of course, they have to have fewer than 500 employees. And they're small in relation to other businesses in their field. 28 million small businesses in the United States. Of all non-farm businesses, almost 97% are considered small. Accounts for over 50% of our annual GDP. And since 1995, small businesses have been the generator of 65% of the jobs created in the United States. And notice next, almost 80% of workers in the United States' first job was with a small business. I can tell you mine was. Let me be specific about that. First job out of college. Small businesses thrive because they are able to respond to customers quickly, and they tend to be more nimble than their larger cousins. Small business failures are not as great as most people think. If a small business closes its doors to start another business, it's considered a failure when it may not be. If form of business change, changing forms of ownership, reported, it's considered a failure. It shouldn't be. And finally, the owner says, hey, it's time for me to retire. I don't have anybody who wants to buy the business. I'm going to close my business. It's considered a failure, when it may not be at all. This is just a slide that talks about the famous business failures. Notice that H.J. Heinz, makers of the ketchup, went bankrupt 6 years after he started. Walt Disney's first company went bankrupt. Here are some causes of small business failures. I'm not going to go through this because it's a rather busy slide. But perhaps the biggest and foremost is not having enough financial resources. Management comes second, planning comes next. Maybe those are intertwined, maybe they change places, but those are big issues for any small business. And here are small businesses that have succeeded. A lot of attention for the customer, like things about salons. Large business sells a franchise operation. Owner pays attention to new competitors. Businesses in a growth industry. These are factors that increase small business success. Again, I don't want to dwell on these, but these are things that businesses have to take consideration into. And you can find these, the reason for failures, figure 6.2 on page 164, and factors increase the chances for small business success, figure 6.4 on page 165. I suggest that you at least look at those to become familiar with them. There's no requirement, there are no questions going to be asked, but it will give you a good understanding rather than me talking about this. Well, what do you need to do if you want to start a small business? Doesn't necessarily have to be in your own field, but ask questions. Find out what somebody else did. I'll give you some examples here for get some experience. I've known people who have worked in hardware stores and then eventually opened a hardware store when the business was up for sale. Take over a successful firm. That's always something to do. I have a good friend of mine who had a State Farm insurance agency for a number of years. He retired last year, and somebody else took over his agency. But he said one of the things that he failed to do, and he would have done over, was learning from others in people he thought were going to be his competitors. He said actually they were really willing to help him. This talks about college classes and things of this nature as well. But he was talking about I should have gone and talked to some of the other guys and gals who were selling for State Farm. I'd learned something from. Now, this is a sort of an ethical question here, making ethical decisions. And you can find this at the top of page 166. Again, I don't, making ethical decisions is not an assignment, not something you have to do, but it gives you a good idea of ethical situations and dilemmas that you might face, and working through that process in your mind, if nothing else, it's a good learning experience. Now, these are the major business functions. I would tell you that the four managerial functions, which we'll talk a little bit later about in the course, planning, organizing, leading, and controlling. But certainly for a small business, you have to plan. You have to have finances. You have to know your target market. You have to be able to manage employees, and last but not least, keep accurate records. You have to know about what's coming in, what's going out, et cetera, et cetera. Business plan. I'm not going to read to you what's on this slide here. There is a very good outline of a business plan on page 169 in your text. The one thing that I will tell you about the business plan is that it has to be concise. It should lay out all the things all the points that are mentioned here, the various sections here that should be addressed. And the most important part that you have is the executive summary, which we'll get to shortly. The business plan, again, takes planning. If you have more than one person, you should actually get some help in writing the plan, but it should essentially be written by one person. The most important piece, now not that the rest of these pieces are not important, the most important piece is the executive summary. The executive summary should be written after the other pieces of the plan are written, because you have all the parts and now you're just putting them in one place. if you write the executive summary first, then everything has to fall in line with the executive summary. Don't do business that way. It's just like writing an abstract for a paper. You write the abstract last. The executive summary has to think. People who you go to try to find investment only have a short amount of time, and they're probably only going to focus on the executive summary, which should never be any longer than 2 pages. So if people are not impressed by the executive summary, you cannot expect investment from them. I attended a seminar in a workshop, I guess, by the way to put it, in Florida back in March, and there was one of the presenters said that there are a lot of people say that business plans are useless, and that many venture capitalists don't even pay attention to reading the business plan. They're just interested in the idea. Well, he got to the end, he said, it doesn't necessarily mean business plans should be forgotten. That's erroneous. If nothing else, a business plan keeps you on track. It is a roadmap, where you want to go and how you're going to get there. And so it's a good idea to write a business plan, whether or not you attract investors. And then finally, get the plan to the right people. You might go to somebody and say, hey, give me a critique on this thing. And that person might help you along and point you in the right directions. So make sure you have the information that needs to be there, and it's accurate, and it's concise. I guess what I want to lead in with this slide is to be careful when you get family into your business. Spell out what's expected. Spell out who's supposed to work and what's supposed to do who and who's supposed to do what. Make sure that you all talk, you're on the same page. Make sure everybody has the same ideas for long-term health of the business. Finally, have plan B. Be careful when you go into business with the family. It's probably worse with family than with friends. It can work, you just have to make sure that things are spelled out. Sources of capital from yourself, from friends, relatives. You can get conventional loans. Sometimes you can get government money, maybe through the Small Business Administration, angel investors. And then, of course, you also have venture capitalists. You have to be careful about these people if you get them, because they want their money, and they want it when they want it, not when you want to pay it back. It's not to say they're bad people. It's just you have to understand what it is they want, and you have to make the contract right. I have a friend of mine who's been in the home security. I have a friend of mine who's been in the home security business for a very long time. And he and another friend started a business, and they got some venture capital money. They were doing very well. And all of a sudden, the venture capitalists came to him and said, we want our investment back. Well, they could pay that back, but they didn't have enough other money, enough other capital to reinvest, et cetera. So they eventually closed their business. Here's ways to get money when you don't have a lot of cash. Get the customers to pay up front. Ask for help, be patient. Outsource tasks that you can outsource that won't cost you a lot of money. Community development financial institutions, big role in the economic recovery, and also have been helping investment. And notice that they have a good return on people paying their investments back. States test new rules for crowd investing rules. I'm not going to pay a lot of attention to that because this is kind of confusing. If you're interested in starting a small business, my advice to you is see the Small Business Administration at your local federal building. This is where we go, Small Business Administration. Notice that they've also started microloan programs, and they judge based upon need. Now here I'm talking about customer need and worthiness of of the project. Small business investment companies, they're an arm of the, or they're have a relationship with the Small Business Administration, and certainly the Small Business Administration will assist you in finding those type loans. And this is the Small Business Development Centers, again, go through the Small Business Administration. Some more information here. You have to know your market. And so that means you have to do some research. We'll talk more about market research when we get to the marketing chapters. Know what it is, know what kind of prices you can charge, and understand that your ability to be successful is based upon your ability to provide service to your customers. Know the needs of your customers. This is really very important. And if you don't know those needs, you probably can't or won't be successful. This is a bugaboo. You have to be careful. We'll talk a little bit more about this when we get to human resource management, but you have to get the right kind of people. You have to get people who are enthusiastic, people who are interested in dealing with customers on a regular basis, and make sure that these are people-friendly people. If they're not, you're probably going to have a real issue, because that's paramount for any small business. And motivation is also critical for these folks. I spoke about marketing research before. You really need to find out about this. Where you're going to locate. Locate as close to your customer base as possible. This cuts down on other costs for you. And find a way that you're going to reach these people. You have to, that's what you have to do. This is critical for any small business. How do I reach my customer base? What is it they need? Obviously, service and price, but those are all things that we need to stop and think about. Now, these are 5 mistakes that business owners make. Afraid to take the leap, and if they did, they were very tepid about it. Bringing on the wrong people. They don't want to give up control, and sometimes that's necessary. An entrepreneur many times is a person who thinks outside the box. So he or she should be continuing to do those things that he or she is good at, and get somebody that's good to manage the business. Don't become complacent, obviously. Early success does not mean long-term success. And then look for continued opportunities to grow and continue to serve probably the target market that you're in. Well, that brings us to the end of chapter 6. We'll be back here next week to talk about chapters 7, 8, and 9, which I think you'll find to be interesting. Chapter 7, management and leadership. Chapter 8, structuring companies, and then chapter 9, production and operations management. So I thank you for your attention, and good night.